Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about deficit speed pulls as a hypertrophy exercise. Now, something that I've been pretty adamant about, at least for the last couple of years, and something I've said frequently, even though the conventional deadlift is my favorite exercise in the entire world, it is not, in its standard format, a good hypertrophy exercise. Now, people say, well, why do so many novice lifters do it? Why do you guys prescribe it to novices with some volume? Well, because for novices, it's a good enough hypertrophy exercise, and it'll teach them to lift heavy weight. It has other benefits for them. But novice lifters aren't strong enough to deal with major axial loading issues or to have big concerns about things like stimulus to fatigue ratios. Okay, they don't need to worry about those things. They just need to do big, heavy exercises with enough training volume and focus on progressive tension, which means more weight on the bar with good form over time. Okay, they don't have these same concerns that a late novice or an intermediate, and certainly not that an advanced lifter have. And when we start talking about more advanced lifters, it becomes very, very difficult to get all these things done correctly. It becomes difficult to get a good stimulus to fatigue ratio because once you have built a very large amount of muscle mass, you tend to be very, very strong. Okay, and that is true no matter how you built the muscle. Some things are going to make you stronger than others. There's different ratios and things that can skew this, but generally speaking, once you've put on a pretty good chunk of muscle, your strength potential is going to be very high. Also means your work capacity is very high. So in other words, for you, a 10 rep max on a lot of barbell movements might be astronomically high to a lot of people. A lot of more novice lifters, once you've built a big base, you could do 10 reps with weights exceeding their 1 rep max. This means it is very, very easy to put a lot of weight on things like your spine for axial loading on different exercises. It means it's hard to beat. It's very easy to beat your body up. Okay, it's very easy to push yourself beyond your limits in terms of certain types of recovery, particularly things like axial loading. Also, the bigger and stronger you get, the higher the ceiling becomes. Like your minimum threshold to gain any muscle becomes much, much higher. It's not to say you can't maintain. Like maintaining muscle is not as hard as gaining it. Tons of research shows that. But what ends up happening with more advanced lifters is that over time, oftentimes our programs turn into maintenance programs to where we don't make any gains at all. It becomes difficult to make gains because our minimum effective volumes to disrupt the body, to disrupt homeostasis in the body, get higher and higher and higher. In other words, for every ounce of muscle you put on your body, it becomes more difficult to gain the next ounce of muscle, let alone talking about pounds. I mean, when we start talking about pounds of muscle for the advanced lifter, you're talking about the equivalent of people talking about earning millions of dollars at that point. It's ludicrous. We're looking in terms of ounces at that point. But every ounce of muscle that you gain, it will be more difficult to gain the next ounce after it than it was the one before it. Our threshold to cause new growth goes higher. And that's when really effective tools like speed work come into play and being selective in the exercises we do with these things. And I think a lot of people, when we talk about dynamic effort work, they get really, really hung up in the idea of the speed curves. And I actually do believe there's some truth to that as far as the velocity and everything else goes. We could argue both directions, right? There are very, very credible people who argue both directions on it. But what they all forget is that from a hypertrophic perspective, speed work is phenomenal. Okay? Even if we disregard the velocity aspects of it and training speed strength and blah, blah, blah. Okay? Even if we disregard that. And I don't think that we should, and I hate to bring those topics up because there are a lot of experts who say it doesn't work that way, but there are experts who say it does. But what we all agree on is the process by which muscle is built, and that is recruiting and fatiguing upper threshold muscle fibers with enough total training volume and of quality reps through sufficient range of motion. Ergo, the deficit speed pull. Particularly when you start doing them with things like bands. A lot of people say, well, I don't have bands. Why don't you have bands? Why don't you have bands? They're not cheap. They're not hard to get. Everyone should have bands. You might not have as heavy a band as I have, right? Because I've got a lot of band tension on here. This isn't just 60 or 70 pounds of band tension. People who can do the math can look it up, figure it out real quick based on those rogue bands. It's a lot of band tension. It's well over 100 pounds. So what do we know about deficit deadlifts? Even experts who say the deadlift is not a good hypertrophy exercise admit that deficit deadlifts are a better hypertrophy exercise than the conventional deadlift. Why? Number one, we move the bar through a longer range of motion. Right? We move joints through a longer range of motion. Also, you have to squat a little deeper. You have to get more knee and more hip bend involved for every inch of deficit you do. And I'm doing a shallow deficit here, but I do really big deficits also. Okay, more range of motion. That's usually one of the big problems people have with the deadlift. They're like, well, it's a partial. It's a half rep at best on every joint involved. Well, when we start adding inches to it, we start making it less and less of a partial. Okay, we start hitting joints at more and more tension as we get into deeper joint angles. Also, what happens with a deficit? We use less weight. We get the similar, if not larger amounts of muscle activation due to the deeper joint angles with less weight. The problem with the deadlift is the axial loading. It puts so much compression on your spine. Okay, that becomes its own recovery issue. Now, that's why things like what I have, the reverse hyper, we could argue can undo a lot of that. That's why I use a reverse hyper religiously. But deficit deadlifts are better. Now, what about when we do speed work? Well, speed work, what is speed work? In this case, I'm working with 50% of my deficit deadlift max, with 25% of my max in terms of band tension. So what would that calculate out to for some of you? Well, that would mean if your max deficit is 400 pounds, you do 200 pounds on the bar, and you do 100 pounds of bands. This is just one example of a layout for speed work. And we explode as hard and as fast as we can. Well, what do we know based on the research? That even with lighter weights, compensatory acceleration hits upper threshold fibers. It hits upper threshold fibers. So even just 10 quick singles like this, because I do these about 30 to 45 seconds apart, right? This entire thing is done in less than 10 minutes. In terms of upper threshold fibers, we know that speed work hits the same fibers that getting close to failure does on every rep. And we know that effective reps are usually the last 5 reps before failure with slower movements. So if you just did 10 singles with this, it's the same as doing 2 sets to failure in terms of muscle fiber recruitment. Okay. But with lighter weights that are easy to recover from. And that's not a big deal. If you can deficit 400, have 200 on the bar and then 25 pounds in bands or chains or whatever. Or let's say you did it raw and you did 60 or 65% of that. That's not much axial loading for you. And it's all singles. So we train for explosiveness when we do this. We get a very pronounced hypertrophic effect, and deadlifts like this is usually the lowest volume speed work we do. You would still grow off this. We would grow off of it. We would train ourselves to be more explosive. We would practice setting up a deadlift a lot. But all of this is in a way that's easier to recover from. This is less fatiguing to yourself than pulling a heavy training max on a deadlift. It's less fatiguing in terms of recovery. It has a much, much larger hypertrophic response. You can grow quite effectively off this. Guys who do speed work seriously usually notice that they get a lot thicker very quick when they first start doing it. It'll make you bigger. And because we're getting those deeper angles, we get more lower body involvement. We get more quad, we get more hamstring, right? Not just back. Get a lot more lower body off the deficit. And we practice setting up and pulling over and over and over. This will not only make you thicker, it will not only get you bigger, it will not only make you more explosive, it will improve your 1 rep max without beating yourself up. All right, people need to remember, speed work is very, very difficult when you do it, if you do it correctly. But it's also very, very easy to recover from. It's very easy in terms of fatigue. an enormous stimulus to fatigue ratio even on axial loading movements. So the deficit speed pull is a winner all the way around if you want to get really jacked. Alright guys, well that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.